Ladies and gentlemen, we have Chris.
My train is headed for freedom. My train. My train is headed for freedom. My train. When folks get on board, it is always nighttime. When they get off, it is such a bright time. 'Cause my train is headed for freedom. My train. My train is headed for sunshine. My train. My train is headed for sunshine. My train. My passengers had enough of sadness. They're going where they will find some gladness. 'Cause my train is headed for freedom. My train. My train is headed for sunshine. My train. My train is headed for sunshine. My train. When folks get on board, it's always nighttime. When they get off, it is such a bright time. 'Cause my train is headed for freedom. My train. I am Harriet Tubman, and I was born in America, but I am Ashanti, granddaughter of an enslaved, brought here in chains from Africa. My parents were born into slavery, but married and faithful to each other, both of them Ashanti. And we are a proud, warlike West African people. And because of this, I never thought of myself as a downtrodden slave. I was born in 1820, Dorchester County, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. It was all forest and field back then. My slave owner was a rich man named Edward Brodus, and he had a huge plantation where he raised apples and wheat and rye and corn. He also sold lumber to the Baltimore shipyards across the Chesapeake Bay. My father was a master woodcutter and would be gone for weeks cutting timber for him, while my mother worked in the big house, taking care of all Brodus's 8 children. Now, when I was born, they named me Araminta. What? Now, do I look like an Araminta to you? No, right? Well, I didn't like that name, so they called me Minty, like I was a piece of gum or something. My mother's real name was Harriet Green. So when I was old enough to choose, I changed my name to Harriet after my darling mother. And I adored my mother, and she had such a heart of suffering, but she never, ever let that crush her loving spirit.
Yeah.
My mother and my father, they had over a dozen children, but all I ever knew were 4 brothers and 3 sisters. I learned early on not to ask what happened to the others, but what do you think happened to them?
They probably died at birth.
They died at birth? Do you agree they died at birth?
Or they were taken away for slavery.
They were taken away and sold into slavery, into the deep south, just like that. Gone forever. It appears to me that if another human being could send another life into slavery, he would be bad enough to send them to hell to live with the devil if he could. Now, as a child, I was always uneasy because every time I saw a white man, I was so afraid. I was so afraid of being carried away. When I was 6 years old, I was taken from my mother. And I was hired out to a very rich family, and they were thinking about buying me. Now, the lady of the house, Miss Susan, she had a whip, and she had just given birth to a little girl. And I was to look after this little girl, and I was to wash her floors, wash her windows, and wash her walls. But you see, if Miss Susan's daughter cried, Miss Susan, she would whip me if I fell asleep because I was so tired. Miss Susan, she would whip me. And so I ran away, and I hid in a pig pen for 5 long days all by myself. But you see, when hunger drove me back, Miss Susan, she whipped me harder than ever before, and then she returned me to Master Brodus as insolent and worthless. Oh, but you see, I thank Miss Susan for those long nights that she kept me awake, because she helped to prepare me for my journey, and for those long nights that I would take, guiding my weary and my hunted enslaved to freedom. When I was 24 years old, I fell in love with John Tubman. Now, he was a handsome devil of a man, and John was also a free black. You see, there were many free blacks in the southern states and Maryland at the time. And John asked me to be his wife. But at first, I said no, because I was enslaved. And if we had children, they would also be enslaved. But John overcame my fears and my concerns with promises to one day set me free somehow. And so we was married by jumping over a broom. You see, in 1844, in the United States of America, black people, people of color, we were not allowed in the courthouses because of the color of our skin. So we weren't considered human, so we weren't allowed to be married. So we went back home. And we laid down a house broom, a broom that you sweep your floors with. We laid that down. We locked hands. And we jumped over that broom together. And just like that, John and I were married. Wow. You see, jumping over a broom is a West African custom and Ashanti tribe of Africa tradition. So even to this day in Hawaii, Our ancestors, they still jump over the broom because of that Ashanti tribe custom, that West African tradition. So we jumped over the broom and we were married. And for 4 years, we were so happy. Except, we were happy except for the fact that John never understood what it meant to be enslaved. You see, at night when I would close my eyes, I could see the horsemen coming. And I could hear the screams of women and children being taken to a far worse slavery than here. Often I would wake in terror screaming that I was being dragged away in chains. And John, he would laugh at me and he would tease me. And once John even said to me, he said, if you ever try to escape, I will come after you and bring you back. Do you believe he meant it?
Yeah.
You do? Well, I don't know if John meant it or not. But I knew that when I had to leave, I dared not tell John in case he betrayed me. And then, around my 29th birthday, I learned that the Reverend Dr. Thompson had ordered me sold. He was going to sell me deeper into the southern states, possibly out of America.
Wow.
So I didn't tell John because I knew that he would betray me. Well, maybe betray me. I don't know, but I couldn't risk it. So I did not tell John, and with no knowledge of the North, I walked away. One night alone. You hear the bells going off, telling me that it's time to go? A Quaker woman, a white woman, she used to stop by the field where I worked, and she would say to me, Harriet, if you are ever in need of anything, come to my cottage, and I will give you directions to a railroad that goes underground to freedom. A railroad to freedom. From then on, all I ever dreamed about was freedom. So I walked away one night alone. Just me and God. And I walked. And I walked. I walked over mountains, through forests, lakes, rivers, dangers by water, dangers by land, dangers from the bounty hunters and the sheriffs, all because of the color of my skin. I just knew that I needed to taste freedom. And so finally, after a long and painful journey, at last, I finally crossed that magic line which separated the land of bondage from the land of freedom. And early one morning, I reached Pennsylvania, and I was in a free state. There was such glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields. I felt like I was in heaven. I'm free. I'm free. I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. I'm free. I'm free. I'm free. I'm free. I'm free. But then came the bitter drop in my cup of joy. I had reached the freedom land. Yes, I was free. But there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom, no one to take me by the hand. I was a stranger in a strange land. You see, my home was down in Maryland because my mother, my father, my brothers, my sister, and my friends, they were all there. I was free, but they still lived in slavery. Oh, how I prayed then, kneeling all alone on the cold, damp ground all by myself. I stayed there all night until the next morning, just crying out to God. Come to my help, Lord, for I am in trouble, and I ain't got no friend but you. Please, please. And then, to this solemn resolution, I came. I was free, yes. And I would go back down south, and I would get my mother, I would get my father, I would get my brothers, my sister, and my friends, and I would bring them all here to the north with the Lord helping me. I then cried out, Lord, I'm going to hold steady on to you, and I know you will see me through. In Philadelphia, I found work as a cook and as a cleaner in different hotels. Whenever I had enough money saved up, I'd make my way back to the land of Egypt, which is what I often called my old home. Now, when the Civil War broke out and the news came of the capture of Port Royal in South Carolina, I decided to go there and work amongst my people. Now, for the length of the Civil War, do you know what I worked as during the Civil War? I was a spy for the Union, which today is called the CIA. I was a nurse. I was a cook. I was one of the only black women allowed to go from military base to military base because I had an official letter from the governor stating that I could travel through military bases nursing our soldiers. White men were paid approximately $11 a week. Black men, if they were paid, were given up to approximately $1 a week. And finally, I was a liberator of thousands of slaves throughout the South. So now, I heard that my parents were in trouble, so it was time for me to go and get them. You see, my father had been betrayed by a slave whom he had helped escape. And this slave, out of fear, had turned back and told his wife the entire plot. His wife, hoping to win favor with her master, revealed the entire plot to him, so my father was now to be arrested and tried. And I decided to save them the expense of a trial, and I brought them up to Canada. And we spent that first winter in Canada, but because of the cold and because of my mother's suffering and complaining, Lordy, I vowed that one day I would bring them to a much more comfortable home that we could all share. I ended up bringing my parents to 180 South Street, which is located in Auburn, New York. Today, that house still stands. It is a national landmark. It is called the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. So now my mother once told me that she ought not to have ever had been enslaved. So I paid a lawyer to look up the will of my mother's first master. And there he found the little girl, Rit, my mother, who was given to his grandbaby until she was of age. master, the little 5-year-old girl who was my mother's master, she died.
Wow.
And there were no provisions in the will as to what to do with my mother. So this meant that she was emancipated, meaning what?
She would be free.
She would be free. Do you agree?
She probably didn't know what to do.
She didn't know what to do? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what she did. So my mother, there was such commotion going on around the house because the 5-year-old girl had just died. My mother is 9 years old and her 5-year-old master just died. So there was so much commotion going on around the house. Nobody was paying any attention to my mother.
Yeah.
So my mother saw that front door.
Said, this is it, man.
And my mother looked at that front door. And my mother looked around the house, making sure no one is watching her watch that front door. And then my mother walked. My mother walked up to that front door and she turned the doorknob and opened it. She stepped onto the porch. She said the sun was so bright and beautiful and warm on her face. My 9-year-old mother proceeded to walk down the stairs, and my mother walked. And she walked. My mother walked by herself for 65 minutes. And then when she was so thirsty, she couldn't take it anymore. She had to stop. So she saw a nearby well. So my mother went up to that well and did everything she could to try to get water into her mouth to quench her thirst. But little did my mother know that her 5-year-old master's 8-year-old brother was following her and just waiting for her to stop. So when my mother stopped to quench her thirst, she felt a little hand behind her collar and she felt someone pulling her. And it was her 5-year-old master's 8-year-old brother. And just like that, my mother was emancipated, meaning to make over as property. It wasn't until later on in the 1800s that the word emancipated meant freedom and liberty. And so I finally brought my mother to freedom, my mother and my father, and they were the last people that I ever brought to freedom. And I sometimes think that my greatest achievement ever was rescuing my parents. Yes, because my parents were old now and their life was simple. But praise the Lord, they were free. I could see them there in the morning, slowly walking by, hand in hand, on the other side of Jordan, safe and sound in the promised land. Because when folks get on board, it's always nighttime when they get off. It is such a bright time. My